game.
Hello, everybody. Artistry and Finesse with you. We are here on Monday night. The trade deadline coming up on Wednesday. Our old friend Mike Colligan from the Hockey Writers back with us. It's kind of nice. This is becoming an annual thing. Mike, welcome back. Good to have you.
Thanks, guys. I don't know that I'm that old to be an old friend, but hopefully at least a good friend in that sense.
None of us are that young anymore, Mike. So we saw that today you did sort of a follow-up on your now famous or infamous Ryan Kesler post, shedding a little bit more light on your thinking as far as the Penguins possibly looking to deal for Kesler. Can you sum up for us what this latest post was about and why you felt like sort of further elaboration was necessary?
Yeah, that's true. It probably haven't helped the Kesler frenzy with a follow-up post, but I wrote last week that I thought the Penguins should go back to kind of this three-center model that they had around Jordan Staal, and I'll honestly admit I did not feel that way as of 2 years ago when the Penguins were deciding what to do with Staal. I figured in this cap era, you can't afford to pay your third-line center that much money. It's just not going to make sense. You've got to figure it out otherwise. But I think we've seen kind of the fallout from that. We've seen Brandon Sutter, in my opinion, just not really turn into a capable third-line center that can carry a line on his own. I think he's fine, with other wingers and with good wingers around him. But unfortunately, as we know, that's not the situation in Pittsburgh right now. So I really pushed for that three-center model, and I think it got misinterpreted a bit where people just saw it for what it was this year, and they insisted that the Penguins had bigger holes at wing and on their checking lines that should be addressed before going out and trying to get another third center in Ryan Kesler. So I just thought clarifying a few of those points and some of the strategic angles that at least from my opinion are coming into play here, I thought would be worthwhile.
So, Mike, if I got from your article today that sort of you look at the Kesler potential trade, or if the Pens were to bring Kesler in, is more of like not just for this year, but for the future going forward. And I know Kessler's signed through next season. But I guess I would ask, like, why is bringing a 29-year-old center with a lot of miles in, like, how is that considered a good future move for the Penguins? Like, if the Penguins are sort of looking, recognizing this is a transition year of sorts and then looking forward to the future, why is this guy who's going to be 30 next year the right answer for that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think, there's certainly concerns with the way Kesler plays, the style of play that he has. Even at age 29, we don't really see those guys last too long. They tend to break down pretty quickly, and we've seen it with Kesler. He's been injured a lot the last few years, but I think this is the first year in a few that he's really been back to his form. He's been Vancouver's best player by far. Maybe that's not saying much given how weak Vancouver's been this year, but I think that when you ask about why that's a better long-term fit, the one thing that I think about is what's Brandon Sutter's future with the Penguins, and I think we would agree that at this point, or at least going forward, he's in that third line spot and in that center spot. And when I look at him, I'll have something up on this tomorrow, but I start to realize that he's going to push about $4 million on his next contract. And he's a guy that's now eligible for arbitration. And the Penguins never go to arbitration with their players. That's their philosophy. And so even though it probably won't go down that route, if he goes to arbitration and that becomes kind of your bar and your standard, I just eyed up a couple guys kind of in his caliber, and I found Kyle Turris at $3.5 million for the next 4 or 5 years. So that's your starting point. Sutter has a better track record than Turris, so I think you're pushing forward easily on the next contract. And in that sense, I would much rather have Ryan Kesler at $5 million if I'm the Pittsburgh Penguins than Brandon Sutter at $4 million for comparable cap hit.
Artistry, this is my wheelhouse. I have to step in here on this one. Okay, so I am totally with you on Sutter not being what he was billed. I can't even see how he would get $4 million. Like, to me, I would love to be the guy arbitrating against him if he's asking for $4 million. Because, like, I would bring in, like, reams and reams and stacks of tape and be like, I don't see how this guy's worth $4 million. So, like, what could the Pens – should the Pens try to move him just so they don't have to pay him that much money because he's not that good?
Yeah, two points there. So with the arbitration, it's a broken system, and we really haven't seen it play out yet. But it is a system that is far from perfect, and you can't bring in piles of tape. You can't bring in third-party opinions. All you basically do is go by goals, assists, like the standard NHL.com stats is all you have to work with. And so you basically line up, okay, Brandon Sutter has, 9 goals right now. Let's say he finishes with 15. You find a guy in a comparable age, comparable salary structure, comparable production, and that's basically your line. So it gets so skewed, and that's why we see teams never go to that, is it's just not even an option. I think that's where the Penguins would never go down that route. And to your point, I think they're not going to pay him that. So one way or another, they're going to have to find another solution at that third line spot.
So what happens, though, if they don't? I just want to understand exactly what the options are with Sutter. If the Pens were like, no, we don't want to go to arbitration, but they didn't trade him, what would happen? Like, he could just leave?
Yeah, so the perfect example was Tyler Kennedy. And I don't know if you guys remember, like, it was probably a year and a half ago, not this past summer, but the summer before, he was in the same boat where he was eligible for arbitration, and it was the goofy year where he had all the goals at the end of the season. He may have even had over 20 goals. And I remember thinking the exact same thoughts that I am now, where if Tyler Kennedy gets the arbitration, he's $4 million, maybe more. And what ended up happening was the Penguins didn't even give him a qualifying offer heading into free agency. He basically became unrestricted, and the Penguins signed him at the last minute before he went to the open market, I think because Kennedy got spooked, and he eventually gave in on the Penguins deal. So Kesler, for Sutter, his qualifying offer is $2.7 million. Right now he's at $2 million. So they'll qualify him at 2.7, but I think when it comes time to sign a contract, if Sutter has that arbitration card in the back pocket, he's going to play it if he gets that opportunity, and I just don't see the Penguins going down that path.
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't think it's a hard sell, definitely not to us, that trading for Kesler when all you're giving up is Sutter, Simone Dupre, and a number one, it's not a hard sell. I think it makes a lot of sense in a vacuum. But what's a little tough to swallow about this scenario, Mike, at least for me, is it makes sense looking ahead to next year and the year after. It really doesn't make that much sense for this year, in that we always look at the Penguins in this Crosby-Malkin era as a win-now team. And it seems to be a concession that this is not going to be the year. Because if you're giving up all those assets for Ryan Kesler, you're really not going to be able to bolster your depth in the way that you want to, are you?
No, I agree 100%, and I think that's at least my realization about this team, and I think coming into the year, that's how I felt as well, is this was going to be a transition year. And that's why they went so hard last trade deadline, because they knew this was coming. They knew the way their contracts were lining up, and with the cap going down to $64 million, that they couldn't build a competitive team the way they're structured right now. So it was going to be a transition year, and I think they're still in that spot. I think they're even farther behind kind of the elite teams in the NHL than I ever expected. When you look at the Western Conference, I mean, there is no comparison between St. Louis and Anaheim and San Jose, LA. It's just top to bottom. I think much deeper teams. The Chicago Blackhawks, geez, they're loaded compared to Pittsburgh, and I think that's where, in that sense, you're not going to go out and make 4 deals over the next 2 days that are going to suddenly put them into that elite class. You got to make a deal that makes you better today, or at least keeps you close, that sets the table for the next couple of years when this team's still in its prime.
Well, what's the alternative? If they don't get Kesler, can you envision a scenario? I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility that if you put 2 decent wingers with Brandon Sutter, that you can have a pretty good third line. There's got to be a couple of guys out there like Sean Bergenheim in Florida, we talk about a lot as a good depth guy, a Thomas Fleischman, guys like that you could plug in there on the wings on the third line, and at least you'd be able to have a credible third line, which we don't have right now. And then you're really just looking at getting by Boston to get to the Stanley Cup. is it really just not feasible in your view that we're going to contend this year by making a few deals as opposed to one big one?
Mike, before you answer, let me just summarize that question. Is there any way we could make Florida's first line our third line? That's
right.
That's it's certainly possible. When you looked at, I think Chicago made that trade yesterday with Brandon Sutter, and he was a guy that couldn't even crack the lineup in Chicago, and I'm sure he's going to end up being the top center in Florida next year. And it just shows, where the difference in teams are as far as these guys go. But I'm not ruling them out at all. I think they have every bit of a chance for what you just said. I don't even think Boston's that good without Dennis Seidenberg, and unless they go out and get a legitimate kind of second stud defenseman to go with Chara, I think they're going to have their weaknesses and they're beatable, and everyone in the East is. But I think the opportunity to get Ryan Kesler, and as you can tell, I'm a huge Ryan Kesler fan, at least on the ice. Off the ice is a different story, but he's a guy on the ice that just does everything in every zone. He can play center. He can play just as well at wing if they move him there. I just think that he brings so many elements. With 2 years left at $5 million, that's a total steal. And these guys they don't come available very often. It's like Zach Parise. I mean, you get an opportunity to get Zach Parise, you pull out all the stops and you try to do it, and that's what they did. And I think they'll do the same with Kesler.
So what's Kessler's no trade clause right now? Like
it's cool. So yeah, he basically chooses where he goes, and it's not like
that's basically. I mean, that's a reason why we could maybe get him for a package that is headlined by Brandon Sutter, who's not really in the same hemisphere, right? Like, because if this was open bidding, there's no way that Sutter, Dupre in a first round would be the best pick, right? Or the best option for Vancouver.
And I think that's what the Penguins are banking on is they just spent, how many weeks with Ryan Kesler. They know where his head's at. I mean, that would probably be called tampering in some sense, but they know where he's at. They know what he's thinking, and I wouldn't be surprised they say, you know what, we know in an open market, like you said, there's no way that the Toronto Maple Leafs wouldn't sell the farm to get Ryan Kesler, and the Penguins would never pay that, or could they even come up with a package to match that. But if with Kesler kind of holding the cards here, like Iginla last year, there's always kind of that backdoor option where Kesler comes in on the last day and says, I only want to go to one team, and that's Pittsburgh. And I think that's kind of where Pittsburgh's kind of positioning themselves right now.
I guess the difference, though, if I'm Vancouver, is that he's signed again for next year. So they don't have to get rid of him the same way that Calgary did. So if they're looking at is Sutter and Dupre, maybe they're just like, Sutter, Dupre, and the 27th overall pick or something. They might just be like, well, why don't we just keep him? Do you think there's a chance that the Canucks just decide to keep Kesler?
I think the risk is we saw them do it with Roberto Luongo last year, and Luongo took the high road. He was a decent guy about it, even though he got totally toyed with, and over the months that dragged on for. I don't know that Kesler is the same type of guy, and that's the risk you take. Is in the offseason, I think they do get a better option as long as Kessler is willing to go to multiple teams. Yeah, they'd get a better return when everyone can kind of get into the mix here. But you take the risk that Ryan Kesler is not happy in Vancouver, and he's not happy that you don't deal him at the deadline like he asked for, supposedly last summer. I think that's a risk that you're kind of playing with fire right there. And from a PR perspective, they're already headed down that hill, and you hate to kind of spark it with Ryan Kesler on top of Luongo and what's already happened there.
Mike, you made mention in one of your posts of the relationship of sorts that Kesler has developed with Bilesman. That might be a draw as far as the Penguins having an advantage in this race to get Kesler. But all things being equal, if as has been rumored, Chicago is also interested, if you're Ryan Kesler, how do you pick Pittsburgh over Chicago?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have any perspective into what's in Kessler's head. And, I don't know if anyone does. I don't even know if the Vancouver Canucks do. And that's the real wild card in this whole situation is where's Kesler at on this? If you think back to the Iginla situation and how that unwound over the weeks leading up to that, supposedly, he had a list of 6 or 8 teams that he was interested in. And I think he was giving Calgary the benefit of being able to go and get some bidding in there, get the market up a little bit. But when it came down to it, we were all shocked to hear that, Boston had made a trade and Iginla didn't want to go there. And so we haven't reached that point in the Kesler situation yet. We still have this supposed open market with, Philly and Detroit and Chicago and Pittsburgh all bidding. But we don't know where this eventually goes if it gets to a point where they've got to pull a trigger on a deal and Kesler holds the final approval on that. So I think that's really where it's tough to predict. And it's tough to know when we don't really get any insight from Ryan Kesler himself.
I think that what swayed Iginla was that he wanted to go down as like the best forward in Flames history. So he was perfectly fine with Ben Hanowski being his replacement. I don't think that threatened his legacy in Calgary at all. Which is interesting because Hanowski was a scrub basically for the Penguins, and like the guys we're talking about moving, like Sutter and Dupre and a first round pick and stuff, they're not like core guys necessarily of the Penguins. I mean, I guess Sutter is, he plays a lot of minutes, but do you see anyone on the Penguins who's like kind of off the radar being moved at the deadline? Like, could we see Orpik or Scuderi or something? I mean, does Shiro and Bilesma, are they sitting there saying like this team as constituted is just not good enough, and if we make moves at the margins, it's still not going to be good enough. So why don't we do something more drastic? Why don't we cut the cord on Scuderi and say like, yeah, maybe it was a mistake to let him walk in 2009, but I'm not going to compound that mistake by having him sign through like 2018. Do you see anyone sort of off the radar on the Penguins being moved? Or
maybe Bo Bennett and his glass wrists.
Hey, I think just to wrap up the thoughts on the Kesler option, I think there's a media perception of this too. When you think of Vancouver trading their best player, they've got to get something in return that fans are happy about. And I don't know how many fans are familiar with Simone Dupre or Brian Dumoulin, but I do know that fans know Derek Pouliot out there. And I do know that fans know Scott Harrington, a big, World Junior Team Canada guy. And, both of those guys names, you say to any hockey fan in the States outside of Pittsburgh, they'll have no idea who you're talking about. But those are players that would register on the radar from a media and PR perspective when you're talking about giving up your franchise player in Ryan Kesler. I would say, go on.
I was just going to ask, if this Kesler thing doesn't work out, Mike, what's the plan B for the Penguins? Do you have any obvious names for us?
I have my names that I would go after. I don't like the rental market, I'll be honest. I don't like Thomas Vanek. I think he's a guy that would, first of all, just be too much. And we just talked about how the Penguins they're not a Thomas Vanek away from being a cup favorite, in my opinion. He'd help. He'd be a great addition, but he's a guy that likes to have the puck on his stick. And that was why I never thought he'd work in New York. Is John Tavares is the same way. And there's two guys fighting for the puck. And we've watched enough of Evgeny Malkin over the last few years that he loves to have the puck on his stick. And there's no way that those two guys are going to click on a line. That's why James Neal's so great with him, is he just goes to the spots and waits. He waits until Malkin, does his thing and skates in circles, and then Malkin has a way of finding him. And so you need to think about, what types of players fit with that, and what types of players do the Penguins need. And I think where it gets a little bit complicated is, what do you do with Pascal Dupuis coming next year? Because I don't believe in a rental. So if you're getting a guy with term, where does he fit in the longer term with Pascal Dupuis returning, Bo Bennett, like you said? That's where, if I look to right wing, a couple names I would think of: Eric Cole in Dallas and Curtis Glencross in Calgary. And I have no insight into either of them being moved to Pittsburgh, but I believe they even both have no trade clauses. But I know they're at a point in those are younger teams. They're developing. And at the point where those guys are as kind of older veterans, I could see those teams saying, hey, let's move this guy, get what we can with a year or two left on their contract. And I think they fit in really good as right wingers on the Penguins. That could go first line with Crosby or third line, checking line next year. And I think that flexibility is how I'd start to think about other options.
Mike, one thing that we've talked about here a bunch, do you think that one of the biggest what ifs in recent Penguin history is not trading Letang at the deadline or during unrestricted free agency last year. How different would this team be, and would we have opened our window a little bit wider if we would have dealt him in the offseason?
I mean, and in hindsight, that's an easy question to answer. But I think at the time, if I take out what we know now, and probably to the point where he's not even a tradable asset, at least for the next few years until he really. I mean, we may never see him play again, let alone this year. And I didn't expect to hear what we heard a few days ago when he really described what happened there, and that's a scary situation. So I think if he returns to play for the Penguins, that's certainly a positive development at any point. But yeah, you think back, and I'm of the camp that, again, I just said it, but if you can get the opportunity to get these guys and keep these guys, these world-class talents, I think you have to find any way to do it, and you don't want to go crazy on it. And I don't think the Letang contract was crazy. I remember I put about a ceiling of $7 million a year on him as far as what I would pay, and they paid very close to that, I believe. And but I think when you have world-class talent, you do everything you can to keep them. And Letang was in that boat. Letang's also a big, PR business guy. There's a lot of people that are fans of Chris Letang, and maybe not those in the hockey analysis world, but when you think of the Penguins fan base, Letang's a big draw for the Penguins, and part of that.
You're saying there's a lot of pink Letang jerseys being sold. Is I think what you're hinting at.
You read between the lines well. Yes. Maybe not among us, but there are fans out there, I've heard.
Wait, well, let's go back and finish because you were going to get to it a little bit earlier. Any surprise guys from the Penguins that could be moved? Like we're talking about draft picks and minor leaguers and maybe Sutter, but anyone else?
I think Matt Niskanen will re-sign, I think. I think he's a guy that if he went to the open market, he could get over $5 million a year. And I've gotten criticized for suggesting that, but I think when you look at what he's been able to do this year, he's played really well. He can play in the power play. He does everything really well, but nothing great. He's just a really solid player. And when you look at like Dennis Wideman got 5.5 out of Calgary a couple of years ago, Niskanen's easily showed that he's in that class, and I think he's probably been the Penguins' best defenseman all around this year as far as consistency goes. But I think they'll keep him, and I think Niskanen really appreciates the chance that he got here to kind of revive his career in Pittsburgh, where when he came from Dallas, he was a guy that mentally was kind of broken down, didn't have much confidence, and I think that'll come into play when it comes time to take a hometown discount. But I don't see any way to bring back Brooks Orpik, and I don't want to keep beating on him because I've made my thoughts known on him before in an article. But to me, he's done.
So would it stun you if the Pens shook up the team and we're like, if we're not keeping Orpik, he's a rental for somebody else? Is that totally out of the question because of the Letang stuff and Paul Martin's injury?
It's not out of the question for me, but I think for the Penguins, even prior to Letang and Martin, I just think that was a deal they weren't going to make. He's a locker room guy, chemistry, character, all that stuff. For me,
go ahead.
Yeah, my last point on that would just be when you heard the Team USA team was announced, and Orpik was basically a shoo-in for that, which I thought was stunning, even though he ended up playing pretty well there. I thought people outside of Pittsburgh would jump all over that, and they didn't, which told me he's got a pretty good reputation, I think, outside of the Pittsburgh fan base that watches him on a nightly basis. And you're going to see it this summer. Some teams going to pay him way more than he should get. And in that sense, you're going to lose him for nothing in the summer. If you trade him now to a team that really wants to get that guy in there on a nice contract for a playoff run, I totally agree that you get some nice assets in return while his reputation's, still up pretty high.
And especially because what you described him as why the Penguins want to keep him, like chemistry and character. I hate speaking about like stuff that happens in the locker room because I have no idea. But just based on what you see on the ice, like the chemistry and the character hasn't necessarily been the strong suit of the team the last couple of years. With the Philly situation, blowing the lead to Tampa, and then kind of letting us letting frustration spiral against Boston last year. So if the Penguins are looking at that stuff as an asset, maybe they're just kind of like they're overvaluing it because he's been there through a bunch of good times, and now like maybe it's just time for him to go. Maybe you just need new voices, not even because his play has declined, just because it's hockey and stuff gets stale and you got to change it up. I would be fine with it. I mean, I guess I'd be concerned with the Paul Martin injury and then with Tang's uncertainty. But had those guys been healthy, I would be screaming for Orpik to be traded.
I think it's tough to speculate, and I do the same. I don't like to even guess at what goes on behind the scenes, but I think the argument, if you're the Penguins, would be they're in first place. He's an assistant captain that's been here forever. It would be an unnecessary explosion with a month left in the season that there's no reason for them to do it. Now, if they were struggling and they were kind of on the borderline of the playoffs, I think that's definitely the type of move that would spark the team. But when you're in first place, I agree they're not perfect. They're far from it in the Eastern Conference, but they're in a situation where it's kind of tough to make that move right now this late in the season.
We've heard that the Penguins are operating as if Letang's not going to be back this year. Is that really the feeling, Mike, in the organization right now, that he's not coming back this year?
Yeah, I don't have a good sense for the organization's take, but like I said, when I heard him describe kind of his situation, and he even made the point that he said, he has good and bad days physically still, and when I heard that, I thought, that's not what I wanted to hear out of Chris Letang, who supposedly is coming back in 4 or 5 weeks,
So what are the chances that we make a move for a defenseman? I think we've been saying here that should be the last priority. We just have to go with what we have, trust that Martin's going to be back for the first round, and it's still a strength of the team where we have a lot of glaring weaknesses up front. But there are some intriguing names out there, like an Andrew McDonald. Seems like he's not carrying an outrageous price tag, and I think he's under contract for a while going forward. What do you think about the possibility of a move like that?
I think McDonald would be great. He's a nice player, and I think he's at $550,000. That'd be a steal, but I think for all those reasons, someone's gonna overpay for him. There's teams that are in tougher straits from a cap perspective that I think will just say, hey, we can get a top 5, top 4 defenseman for $550,000 cap hit. They're going to overpay, and I think they'll be a little bit more desperate than the Penguins. But in that sense, I wouldn't be surprised if the Penguins do go out and kind of get one of those depth defensemen, because if you assume Letang is out, which I think is safe at this point, Paul Martin having surgery, he's going to be pushing, right around that playoff time, maybe a couple games beforehand. But if there's any setback there, then you're talking into playoff time, and that's just going into the playoffs. And we've seen what happens when you get in the playoffs. Ray Shearer's perspective is you need at least 10 NHL defensemen going into the playoffs, and so you have enough depth to get through 4 rounds. And I think it's safe to say the Penguins really aren't in that position anymore with the current injuries and just their situation on the back end there. So I wouldn't be surprised they do go out and get a depth defenseman if the right deal was there. It's a tough market right now, but I wouldn't be surprised at all.
Is backup goalie now the last priority for this team?
Yeah, I think so, and I think even when Vokun wasn't even in the picture, and who knows how that'll play out. I think what will happen there is he sits out the year and shows up for the playoffs when the cap disappears, and they don't have to waive Zatkoff or any games like that. I think they'll bring him back into the picture. But even before that, I thought you're really going to spend assets and cap space on a backup goalie that theoretically should never play. And if he does need to play, that means you've got bigger issues. I mean, it's a safety blanket. He's a luxury. Thomas Vokun's a luxury to have, but it's not a necessity. And when you have other roster issues that are going to be in your face every single night, I think those are the ones you address before backup goalie.
It's such a wild card because nothing the Pens do is going to matter if we get the bad Fleury in the playoffs. It's just not going to matter. Like, they could bring in Kesler, they could bring in all these guys, and if they don't get a better performance from Fleury, and they got Zatkoff as a backup, it's all sort of for naught. And like that's but I'm with you. Like, there's nothing you can really do. How do you shore up that backup spot right now? There's too many other holes. It was something I think early in the season. You think like, all right, well, we can maybe fix up the backup position if right after Vokun got hurt. But I don't know what you do now. Are you confident in Fleury that he's turned a corner, or do you think that we're maybe in for the same sort of ending that we've had the last couple of years with him?
I would say. I hate to be negative, but I think we've seen this story enough before, and I would not be surprised if Fleury has his struggles, and we'll see how he's going to have problems. There's no playoff stretch that's perfect and clean and smooth. So he's going to face adversity, and it's going to be a matter of, does he respond like last year, or does he respond like the year they won the Stanley Cup, when you remember he got lit up against Detroit and returned to play, I think, some of his best hockey of his entire career. So we've seen both out of him, and I know that's why the Penguins gave him the long-term contract is, when he took them to the Cup Finals, they even said that's how they felt he was, a guy they could put their faith in and give the long-term contract to. Now that we're a few years down the road, maybe you regret that a little bit, and who knows what happens, I think, a year from now when he's a free agent. That'll be a big question, but I think we might have an answer sooner than that as far as what happens in the playoffs this year, because if he goes through the same problems that he had last year, that'll be it, because this is a team in its prime with Malkin and Crosby playing hockey like they can. You can't keep having goaltending be the number one issue in the playoffs.
He needs a favorable matchup in the first round. I wonder if he would have been better off last year if he played Ottawa in the first round, who couldn't. Like, the Pens were clearly better than the Islanders and the Senators, but the Islanders, could get up and down the ice a lot better. And it's definitely going to be a confidence thing with him. I mean, if he gives up a goal in the first minute of the first playoff game, which is like at least 50-50 that's going to happen, it's going to be a nightmare. I'm worried about it. I really am. Like, it sort of affects my ability to like really break down some of the other stuff and think about it, because I know it's all for naught if we get the Fleury we got the last 2 years. So, Artistry, what do you think? Are you confident in Fleury?
I don't see how you can really be that confident. I mean,
I'd like somebody to come on here and be like, God damn it, I am confident in Fleury. He is going to shut everybody out.
You can bring in the Canadian Olympic team, and, you got, like, Kyle Okposo shooting from behind the net off the back of his pads, and it's going to be a disaster. We're all just passengers here. We're all just going to bear witness to whatever goes down. But, I'm interested to hear from you, Mike, where you project the cap going from here, because you see a lot of these contracts being handed out to goalies now, goalies that aren't even really elite as far as I'm concerned, getting $6, $7, $8 million. The New York Rangers, I don't know how they're going to feel in a few years paying Lundqvist $8 million. But where do the Penguins turn if Fleury melts down a bit?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we've already seen them start to think ahead a little bit as far as their drafts and collecting some of these young goaltenders that sound like they're still a few years away. But Jeff Sackhoff showing that he's at least close. He's probably not there yet or ready to take the reins. But
terrific guy, Jeff Sackhoff. You watch In the Room. It seems like there's a locker room presence.
Yeah, that's why let Orpik go. You got Sackhoff.
What's funny is I think Orpik's, he's kind of the bad cop in the room. And I'm telling you, I've had conversations with Ryan Kesler. You think Orpik's bad? Wait till Ryan Kesler. And what's funny is that doesn't fit with the Penguins. It's like, good guys and everyone's all happy-go-lucky. But I think they need that and they want that a little bit. They need an edge. And what I never appreciated until the last year or so was Bill Guerin. And when he came in at the deadline, I assumed it was kind of like, cheerleader Bill Guerin. I've been there before, do it for Rudy, type thing. But what I've realized from talking to people is he was not a pleasant guy. And he got in people's face, and he was not afraid to do it. And it was kind of like the edge that this team, the Penguins team, needed. And I think they expected that from Brendan Morrow and Douglas Murray and especially Jerome McGinley last year. And McGinley's not that type of guy. He's not going to get in people's face. He's been there for 10 days. It was something that just wasn't comfortable for him. But I think if you need to have that kind of edge in the locker room, and if that's a criticism you hear about this Penguins team, is they're just a little bit too loose and a little bit too soft, and you need a guy like that, I think, in the room, especially when you get in the playoffs.
Well, isn't that sort of – we've been hearing that for the last few years. I mean, isn't that, in a way, an indictment of Crosby as a captain? Like, that we've sort of been framing a lot of moves that the Pens have made or should have made the last few years around how it impacts sort of like team chemistry and the mood behind the scenes. Can't that be interpreted as like a sort of black mark against Crosby as a captain? Not saying he's a bad captain, but that's something to raise an eyebrow, right?
I'll take that one. I don't think so at all. I mean, that's presuming that if you're lucky enough to have a transcendent player, that player is necessarily, a vocal locker room presence. And I just don't think that's the case at all. I don't see how you could have Sidney Crosby on your team and not have him be the captain.
No, I understand, but the problem that's I'm just sort of playing devil's advocate a little bit here too. Like, if the problem is that the team is like a happy-go-lucky and nobody's standing up and saying anything, like, he's the guy that sets the tone for that. I'm not saying he has to necessarily be the one to fix it, but like, if he's the one creating that and that's a problem, then maybe there's a little bit there. I don't know. I just wonder if.
Well, he doesn't strike me as particularly happy-go-lucky. He seems fairly intense. He's probably quiet. He's probably not the guy that's going to go to Malkin and say, "Get your head screwed on straight. Stop taking a penalty every game in the last 2 minutes of the game."
Well, he would be. That'd be the pot calling the kettle black a little bit too, because Crosby's no stranger to that either.
Yeah, but I think that there's no question that the Penguins could use a little bit of that in the locker room. I don't think it's fair to say Crosby has to be that guy. Your captain could be like a Steve Yzerman who leads by example. There's plenty of captains like that. Doesn't have to be Mark Messier.
No, I guess you don't. I know Crosby doesn't have to be that guy, but the fact that you need that guy, maybe that shows there's something else lacking. I don't know. I'm speaking ignorantly because I don't really know, but I'm just saying, like, as we keep hearing about the room and the personalities and all this stuff, he's the guy that should be setting the tone. Same as Miles.
Let's let Mike be referee here. Mike, what do you think?
Well, first of all, I think we don't know what goes on. We don't know what happens in the intermissions, and I think we all agree, like, we can't speculate on who gets in whose face, and I can only go on what I hear, and that's probably third and fourth and fifth hand accounts of it. But I think you guys have played the game. You know what it's like to kind of be in the locker room in sports, and you know what it. And I'll tell you, when I think back on teams that I was on, and I've been the worst player on some teams, I've been the captain on other teams. It's usually not that captain that is that in-your-face guy. It's rarely that, but there's always like a secondary guy that's kind of surly, and it's exactly that. He gets in people's faces, and he'll be brutally honest when you need to, and I think that's the dynamic. It's not the captain just being a dictator and pushing people around and saying, "You got to do this because you're not as good as me," but it's kind of that middle road guy. Maybe it's Brooks Orpik, or maybe it's Bill Guerin or something like that, but it's just a different dynamic to the room that kind of counteracts what you're hearing from the captain, kind of pushing him down as usually the most talented player.
I would like to see someone speak up in the locker room, just go up to Tanner Glass and be like, "Tanner, you're not going to play tonight. You're not very good." It's hard for me to say. It's probably hard for you to hear, but like, you're really not that good, and we're going to need you to sit down. And if that's a winger or a defenseman, that's fine too. I don't care who it is. That's the truth I want to hear in the locker room. Maybe Crosby should do that.
What's interesting is someone suggested this to me on, I think it was on Twitter, and I hate that I can't remember who it was, but someone said that maybe Jacques Martin should be kind of that bad cop. And you've got Dan Bylsma in there, and you've got Jacques Martin, and Martin can be be the guy that just comes down hard on everyone and kind of is that disciplinarian. And I'll admit I have no sense for what the dynamic is there, and maybe Martin is that guy. But I think, it can come from the coaching staff as well, where you have Dan Bilesman there, and we all know what he's all about. But you need that dynamic to it, whether it's Granato or Martin that kind of comes in and is really willing to get in guys' faces and even, break some relationships there if he needs to get things done.
Mike, I don't want to keep you for too much longer, but I want to run a couple last few things by you. And artistry, whatever you have as well. We just kind of lob these at Mike. You said in one of your stories that if Kesler came to the Penguins and was put up with Crosby, that you'd be all right with Jason Megna sort of playing on that third-line center role. Do you have any concern that this is like Dustin Jeffrey 2.0, where sort of the fans have seen a little bit of flash and we think he could be a productive player, but like the coaching staff just doesn't feel that way, and so he never really develops. And then 3 years from now, he's going to be traded for like a 7th-round pick.
No, I'll tell you, I totally believe in Jason Megna. I'm not going to put expectations on him for this year or next year even, but I think he is the third liner of the future on a great contract, and I think he's a guy that can play up on the first line. He can play third line. He can play center. He can play wing. He's a smart player with good speed, good hands. He's got all the tools to be a good player one day. And like I said, I don't want to kind of set that expectation now that he's the savior or the replacement for Sutter. But I think he's a really nice player that I've talked to people that knew him since he was 14, 15 years old, and they said he's a late bloomer at every level, whether it was back to midgets or his junior team, or he walked on to his college team. At every level, he's kind of been slow to develop, and he went undrafted in the NHL. But we're seeing, just to make it up to this level is an accomplishment. And when I look at his skill set and what he brings, I think he could be a pretty nice player.
So you're saying you're starting like an exploratory committee for Megna 2016?
I think he's going to have a tough competition with Hillary Clinton, but I will back Megna. Yes.
A super PAC for Megna.
I just can't believe you said that about Dustin Jeffrey.
I know. He's one of your favorite players. Mike, here is what I think is the hardest question facing anyone right now. And no one has given us an answer that's satisfactory. Why is Taylor Pyatt on the Penguins?
Oh, God. That's you're not going to get an answer from me either. I'll tell you what's funny is I would say 4 or 5 times a day I get the question on where the Penguins salary cap situation is. And as of last Tuesday, when Ray Shero talked to the media, he said his quote was, "There's a lot of moving parts, and teams around the league are in a tough spot where they have not a lot of cap space." And I think it was interpreted that the Penguins were one of those teams, and it's not. If they throw Chris Letang on long-term IR, if they throw Paul Martin on long-term IR, there's easy fixes there. And I'll tell you, the one thing I kept thinking was Taylor Pyatt's a really easy fix to clear up some cap space, because he's not any better than Zach Sill at $500,000. You throw him back on waivers and back into the ocean, I think you clear your cap space, and that's a pretty easy move for anyone to make.
All right, Mike, lightning round. What's the more ridiculous number? Ryan Callahan at $7 million a year, or Taylor Pyatt at $1.55 million?
If there's term on Ryan Callahan, it's Ryan Callahan. He's a guy that we just talked about. Kesler, he's going to break down too. We've already seen it a little bit with him, but the team that gives him over 7 for 6-7 years, they're going to regret the back end of that contract.
He'll be the next Scott Gomez, probably. Like in 4 years, if he finishes the season with like 5 or 6 goals, it wouldn't surprise me.
And here's what's crazy though, is the cap is going to go up a lot. So we're talking, $6-7 million right now in relative terms. We know what that kind of feels like. But 5 years from now, we might be shocked at what $6 or $7 million might not be a big deal when some of the stars in the league are making 12 and even more dollars than that million.
When Jason Megna makes $6 million, you mean?
He's going to come back to us.
That'll be a bargain. Jason Megna will be a bargain at $6 million. All right. Anything else,
well,
Artistry? I'm done. I think Mike's covered it all for us. And
yeah, it's going to be one of the more dramatic deadlines, I feel. Whatever, if nothing happens, it'll be dramatic. It'll be something really revealing as far as what the Penguins think about their prospects this year, I think. Well, Mike, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, that's the number one message, I think, is we always get honest opinions when it comes time to trade one of those guys. And when you look back on Angelo Esposito or Luca Caputi or Noah Welch or countless others, most of them have not been the big prospects that we were led to believe. And I think that'll be very telling is the guys that they're willing to give up, I think will probably beat the ones that they don't believe in over the long term.
Right. Well, Mike, great to have you here as always. We'll look forward to Wednesday and chatting with you again soon.
Thanks, guys. Anytime.
All right. Until next time, everybody. GTOG.
Get to